Hi, welcome to ITC 596. This little video is going to talk about assignment 2 and give you some guidance to help you to complete it. So assignment 2 is a risk assessment assignment. It's due on the 3rd of January 2021 and it's worth 10%. Okay, an individual assignment. So as with all those assignments, you will need to read the DR Alarms case study document before attempting this assignment. Now, the DR Alarms case study document is in the resources section of ITC 596, and what you'll find there is this document will paint the picture of DR Alarms, what's been going on, what its equipment is, how it's doing things, how it applies things. It gives some indications of where the company is going and what it's trying to do, some of its future activities shown there, and so forth. So it's going to give you quite a lot of information. I would suggest you spend a fair time reading it, and I would certainly recommend you go back and read it again before each of these 3 assignments, because there will be different things that you'll find that you're going to have to pick out for each assignment. So make sure you read it and read it fairly carefully. Okay, so for this assignment, you are a consultant, an ICT security and risk consultant, and you've been approached by DR Alarms, excuse me, to help them recover from a cyber attack. So you've successfully managed to isolate the machines affected. You brought the company system back into operation, but they're unsure what damage has been done, and you've been asked to see what you can do to prevent this occurring again. So you have indicated to the MD, the managing director, that, you know, as a starting point, the very first step, you need to be aware of what are the risks and threats to the company, as well as the controls that you can use to mitigate those risks. Now, the MD is, you know, a fairly practical chap. He's been involved in alarm systems and things all his life, but he doesn't see the point of this. He's not really convinced this is a really valid approach. You know, he probably takes the attitude, you know, like a lot of small companies do. We're too small to be affected by this sort of thing. They've never experienced this type of attack before, you know, but it's got him a little worried, so he agrees, okay, give me a report on the risks that you foresee. You've talked him into accepting the report. So what you're doing first, the first part of your task in this assignment is to write a report for the managing director that explains why it needs to understand its risk exposure and how to minimise it. And so your report should also clearly state the possible consequences to the company if those risks are not addressed. So this is part 1. Okay, so this report should have a word count of about 2,000 words plus or minus 10%, and your report should have references in APA 7th edition format. So that's the first part. The second part is an appendix to that report, and this is where you identify the major risks. Now notice I use the word major here, because what we're talking about is just find the big ones. There's quite a lot of risks there, but get the major ones, the ones out that you think are really important. So for each of these risks, you've got to give a brief description of the risks identified, and you may be able to group them together. For example, you know, there might be some risks to a server. So for example, patching is an obvious one. Rather than talk about every individual type of application that needs to be patched and the server itself, you might say patching is a risk and it needs to be kept up to date, for example. So that, you know, is a similar type of thing, so you can group all of those types of risks together if that's appropriate. So for each risk, having described it, you then give a brief summary of its impact or the consequence if the risk was to occur. Right? What happens? What's the likelihood of that risk occurring? What's the risk assessment, your inherent risk assessment? This is the raw, untreated risk. If you've done absolutely nothing to reduce the likelihood or the consequences of it. What are the controls that you would use to mitigate this risk? And what is the risk remaining, the residual risk, after you've put those controls in? Where does it put your risk exposure? And what's the priority? Right? Which one is more urgent than the other? You know, so you've got to come up with a priority system here as well. So this risk register is not counted as part of your word count, okay? This is a separate thing. The word count applies only to the first part of the report. So the approach to use. So this is really a fairly common scenario for private industry. A company, the management thinks this doesn't apply to us for any number of different reasons. You know, probably the biggest one in this case is we're too small, right? So your task here is to write a report that points out the obvious and some of the not so obvious risks that the company has with its current approach to using ICT infrastructure. Your report should clearly show the MD what exposure to risks that his company has, how that risk can be minimised, and what the consequences are if that risk is not addressed. Right? So make sure that you carefully read that DR Alarms case study, as not all of the obvious risks are actually included in the document. Some of them are merely implied, but you know, they're there. So again, the approach, we talked about this risk register, and so ideally this was probably done in the table type format. This is the best way to do it. This is the requirement which we talked about a few moments ago, and you need to use these headings: risk, impact, likelihood, assessment, controls, residual risk, priority. Okay, so they're the headings for your table, and a big hint here: turn this part of your report into landscape orientation. It makes it so much simpler. You can get everything across the page that way. So some hints. Again, make sure you read all that case study. It's lots of bits in there that need to be very carefully considered, but that's all the hint I'm going to give you on that one. Also then make sure, having read the case study, read through the marking criteria so you've got a good idea of what we're going to be looking for in each question, and that will start to give you some ideas about maybe the approach you need to use. I don't expect you to find every possible risk and threat, but you do need to find the obvious ones and identify them, and I've got to admit they are relatively obvious. Don't forget your references. You know, if you're using EndNote or Mendeley, you know, try practicing that cite as you write option before you get too involved in your assignment, because that will actually start to make life considerably easier for you. So if you haven't done it before, now is a really good time to start. So finally, this is a really good example of a real-world problem. The idea that risk management is just not a problem, or we're just too busy to worry about this sort of thing, or too small, or what other reasons, has been heard by people in the security industry for years. And we've all seen some fairly spectacular failures as a result of it. So from our viewpoint, though, this puts you firmly straight into the middle of a problem that has considerable issues that you've got to consider. And it's very much like the sort of problem that you'll face. Not everything is going to be laid out for you. You've got to go looking for issues and looking for problems that are going to arise, particularly in this current cybersecurity environment. So it's going to start you thinking about the issues and thinking about how you need to approach them. I hope you enjoy it. Good luck.